Alright, this is the gear list that I used for the 2015 elk season. If you remember last year, we were rifle hunting, a little bit colder, a little bit higher chance of snow. This year, in September, better chance of rain, but a lot milder temperatures. So keep that in mind as I'm going through this list. Overall, I was very happy with the list. Only one thing that I would add to this list that I didn't have on it, and maybe a couple future possible upgrades, but other than that, I was very happy. I have this list down in the description as both a PDF and Excel format that you can download, and I'll be showing little screenshots of it throughout the video. And you'll notice that there's two columns. The left side is basically the stuff that I brought this year. The column on the right is more my ideal pack list with a couple of the potential upgrades that I could make if I wanted to in the future, how much they would cost. And then I also eliminated some of the extra camera gear that most people won't be bringing to give you guys a more realistic expectation of the kind of weight that you can achieve. So let's start off with the pack. If you guys remember from last year, I used the Alps Commander frame and bag for that trip. And after I was done, I had contemplated upgrading to something more expensive like a Kifaru or a Kuiu or a Exo Mountain pack. And I'll be honest, I did something a little bit different this year, and I don't think I ever have any need to upgrade to something like that. What I basically did was I took the Alps Commander frame, left the bag at home, just took the frame, and then I used this Cabela's Deluxe Whitetail day pack. And then everything else I just lashed on outside. I think it's a lot more versatile, and I was very pleased with how it performed. So, and basically what I did was I took the frame, and the only thing I did to the frame, apart from being stock, was I removed this top bar, which is pretty easy to do. And then I took tape and I taped all these key rings flat to the metal bars so that they don't make any noise. I took my heavy jacket, of which I only had one on this trip, laid it flat onto the frame. Then I took my sleeping bag, which is in a waterproof stuff sack, put it right here on the load shelf. I took one of my game bags, put all my food in it, put it right above the sleeping bag. Then I took the day pack, put it kind of over the middle of the pack, strapped on the load shelf, compressing the sleeping bag even more, and then I just took the straps that come on the frame, and that's how I attached the day pack. And then I put my bow on top of everything and bungeed it to the frame. And you notice one thing about this frame system is it's fairly heavy compared to what you could get if you just combined it into one. I mean, we're looking at what, 8 pounds? But the thing you gotta remember is if you're doing a base camp setup like what we did, is you're only carrying in this frame for the first part of your trip and then if you shoot an elk. So after day one, the only thing I'm carrying is that 2-pound day pack every day. Now, as far as the day pack itself, I was extremely pleased with this. And in fact, for the price, which was $100, I think it'd be hard pressed to find a lighter weight pack that has this much space, is waterproof on the outside, and has a built-in hydration reservoir. And I think part of the reason for that is that it's marketed toward whitetail hunters. And it seems like as soon as you break into that Western hunting pack, the price skyrockets. But honestly, this thing performed awesome. So I think it's a great buy if you're looking for a day pack for out west. It's kind of heavy right now because here's another thing that I found I can use it for. Inside here, I have my Lone Wolf Assassin platform and camera arm. So I can use this for deer hunting as well. I can take 2 mini sticks, strap them to the outside, and for carrying my ultralight deer hunting setup, I think this is probably the best thing that I've stumbled upon, to be quite honest. Same thing with that frame as far as multi-use. We use that frame back for bear hunting. We could take that load shelf, put a bunch of 5-gallon pails on top. Really, I mean, having this day pack and that frame separate, you're looking at less than $200 and every bit of the versatility, in my opinion, that you could get from one of those $300 or $400 or $500 packs. Oh, and the hydration reservoir that comes with this, it's 2 liters and it has an insulated hose, which is kind of nice. Another thing that adds to that value at $99. So then let's move on to the shelter. Last year I used a solo tent from REI, and with all the snow I had a lot of issues with condensation, and it was still over a 3-pound tent. I ended up selling that one, and I bought an MSR Hubba NX 2-person tent. And one of the reasons I bought it is getting all these amazing reviews, winning all these awards. It's lightweight for a 2-person tent, and you can actually pitch it without the mesh inner. You can pitch it with just the poles and the rainfly, and that option is like just a hair over 2 pounds, but yet you still have the floor space and the vestibule space and the overall volume of a 2-person tent. And if you're completely unexposed to the idea of camping without a floor, I guess kind of the real basic pros and cons of going floorless. The cons are that it is more prone to condensation. You have to be a little bit more careful with your tent site selection, and there's always the chance of like mice running in. That's about the main things you get as far as negatives. The benefits of going floorless are, one, you really cut down on the weight and you get a lot higher floor space and volume per weight. So like I said, I was able to use the space of a 2-person tent to have me, all my gear inside, and yet I was still about half the weight of that solo tent that I used last year. From a condensation standpoint, there was condensation. It never really dripped. If I could reach up in the morning and wipe my hand on the top, I could feel the water, the moisture, but it never got my sleeping bag wet unless I rolled around a lot and touched the wall, which is something you got to keep in mind if you roll around a lot when you sleep. And there was one point in time in the trip when I did have a mouse actually jump on my head, and I was kind of half asleep. I just kind of shook it off and I could hear it squeak as it ran away. So that was kind of funny, but bugs were not an issue at all. The main reason bugs weren't an issue was because it would cool down so much by the time we go to bed. So during the day, if we were back at camp, I would notice there'd be flies and stuff inside the tent. But once it got dark, it was completely empty. All those bugs kind of went dormant. You just want to make sure that you have your sleeping bag closed up before you leave for the day, because otherwise if bugs were to crawl into your sleeping bag and then you leave for the day and then it gets cold at night, they're going to go dormant, but then when you climb into your sleeping bag, it's going to warm up again and you're going to have bugs inside your sleeping bag. So just make sure that your sleeping bag is closed up before you leave, and you shouldn't have any bug issues assuming that it gets cold enough at night. I talked about tent site selection. The ideal scenario is that you want to have your tent set up on kind of a little mound, no trees around. And the reason is, if you have rainfall, that rain's just going to run off the side of the tent and not get underneath, unless it rains so hard that the ground soaks up all the water and it starts running. And if you're on a gradient, which is pretty common trying to camp on a mountainside, you could potentially in a very heavy rainstorm have water start to run into your tent, but if you're on a little mound, the water's going to flow around you. Sure enough, when it did rain, the ground soaked all of it up, and I could actually see a line of wet dry around the edge of my tent. It was completely fine. A couple other benefits about doing that floorless shelter is, one, you can cook inside, and two, you can leave your boots on when you go inside. So I remember one day in particular, we had all just gotten back into camp, starting to cook outside, and then all of a sudden it started raining. And then once it started raining, I was actually able to zip open my tent. I got all my clothes on still, put the food inside, crawl quick inside, zip the thing shut. It was a matter of 10 seconds, and I could continue cooking and stay completely dry, which was really, really nice, I'll be honest. There's really a lot to be said about the benefits of a floorless shelter, in my opinion. The one last thing I'll say about it is that this is definitely a 3-season setup. If it were going to be colder, or really high winds, a lot of precipitation, a lot of snow, I would probably recommend switching to an integrated stove shelter, something like what Efore would offer with their sawtooth or their teepees or their mega tarp. You get a lot higher price tag with something like that, but I think if the weather is really going to be a concern, you almost have to go that way. Otherwise you're going to be miserable. And actually on Rockslide, there's a couple of threads of guys doing their own DIY sawtooth and their own DIY mega tarp. So I'll try and post the links to those down below in the description as well, because that may be something I would potentially take on down the road. So then for sleeping, I had the same sleeping bag as last year. It's a 15-degree bag. I think it's 650 filled down. Worked completely fine. I was never cold. To store it, I used the Sea to Summit Evac 13-liter dry sack. It's completely waterproof, yet it can still breathe. Once I took my sleeping bag out, put it in the tent, I transferred all my food to that bag, and then I hung it up in the tree. I I used the Therm-A-Rest Women's Pro Light Plus. The reason I went with the women's is because my girlfriend had it, and the only other sleeping pad that I have is one that's probably got like a R value of 1. Just would not have been warm enough, I don't think, in that 35, 40 degree weather. So I used hers instead. I also cut out a piece of Tyvek, just a little bit longer than my sleeping bag, a little bit wider, and that's what I put on my sleeping pad and then the bag. All right, so here's my cook kit. I basically have absolutely no intentions of changing anything about it unless I go on a car camping or a canoe camping trip when I have the luxury of bringing more equipment. So essentially I have the fold-up spoon, which unfortunately did not fit inside here, but you can see what does fit inside the pot. This is a 700 milliliter titanium pot from Snow Peak. I have my stove, Bic mini lighter, a little tripod for the gas canister, the small size 100 gram isobutane propane mix, and I was able to use just one of these 100 gram canisters. I brought 2 just in case, because when I did my math I knew I was going to be right near the edge and I didn't want to run out on the last day, but it turns out one was just fine. The stove, look at how tiny that is. It's just crazy. It weighs like 1.5 ounces. But now with this setup, it's easy because it's got labels on the inside of the pot for how many ounces of water you have. So you can just fill that up with water, and the meals that I brought, it was anywhere between 12 and 20 ounces. So it was really easy to actually fill that cup up to the exact right amount. Set it on top, put the lid on, boil the water, pour it in the bag, and it'll be good to go. If you remember from my video last year, I used an MSR Pocket Rocket as my stove. Only a few ounces heavier, and the reason I decided to downsize the stove was that for nesting everything inside the 700 milliliter pot, the Pocket Rocket stove was actually just a little bit too big. I couldn't get that Pocket Rocket to fit inside here, it was too long. But this little Fire Maple 300T, which is also called the Hornet, worked absolutely fine. The only reason I would ever potentially switch away from the stove is if for some reason in the future it breaks. But other than that, I think I paid $35 for it on eBay. It is a Chinese manufactured stove, so you can't buy it from any US retailers. You can only buy it on like eBay direct from China, or if you get lucky like I did, you can find somebody that has a new one in the US and then they can ship it really fast. So this one I actually found from somebody listing it in Florida as a brand new stove, and it came in the box unopened for like 35 bucks, and I got it in less than a week. It was a little bit too long to start with and stuff would rattle, so I just took a rubber band and shortened it up a little bit, and then it fits in the pack nice and easy, nice and compact. Here's what I brought for water filtration on the trip. What I brought last year was just these 2 items. And what I did last year was I just filtered the water into little soft platypus water bottles, very similar to what these are. This year, since my day pack had an integrated 2-liter reservoir, I just filter the water directly into that and it worked fine. The Sawyer Squeeze I'm still a big fan of. It's not as fast as some of the pump models of water filters, but it's a lot faster than the tablets. It's extremely easy to use. The one thing I will say is that last year, I really struggled because I hadn't backflushed it before I went on the trip. I used it in the Boundary waters, didn't backflush it, brought it out to Colorado, and by the end of that Colorado trip, it was getting really hard to squeeze. So what I did as a just in case was I brought the plunger on this trip. I used it once, I probably didn't need to, but it was just kind of nice having that extra security, knowing that if my water filter did start getting slow, I could just backflush it and be fine. Let's go on to the packed clothes, and remember on this trip I was planning on weather between 30 and 70 degrees. It was pretty close to that. I would say at night it was between 35 and 40 most days, and at the heat of the day it was probably upper 60s. So I packed an extra pair of merino wool socks, midweight. The ones I wore every day were lightweight. I also packed a few extra pair of boxers, some Under Armour Cold Gear pants, which I never wore once. an 800 fill down vest, which I wore a couple times, the Cabela Space Rain jacket, which I also wore a couple times, and then I brought an extra beanie, which I never wore once. Talking about that Cabela Space Rain jacket, it's a fairly decent buy for the money. It's a little bit thin, I think, for walking through really heavy cover. I think you're gonna end up with some cuts in the fabric, that type of thing. But for what I used it for, which was just basically leaving it in the pack until there was rain and then putting it on, not doing a whole bunch of movement, it was fine. A little bit noisy, but again, if it's raining, a little bit of noise isn't the biggest deal. I don't think that for this type of hunt, I would want to spend any more money to get a more expensive rain jacket. I think this one worked just fine at like the $84 that I paid for it on sale. Personal hygiene, pretty self-explanatory. Maps, we had some maps from startmyhunt.com. You know, the topo itself was very nice. It was easy to read. We had a nice big, I think it was 11 by 17s that we brought on the trip. The hot spots that were marked on them, some of them I really liked, some of them were okay. And then there was a lot of areas that I probably would have considered hot spots after being there, but weren't marked on the map. So I think they're pretty nice for going to a new area, just getting an idea of where to start out, and then just kind of let yourself expand based off of those areas. Because the other thing you got to remember is a lot of those areas that were marked as hot spots look really good on a map, and other hunters also see that they look really good on a map. Hot spots and the next drainage over were just packed with hunters. There was no elk because of the hunter pressure. If there was no hunter pressure, there probably would be hot spots. So just keep that in mind. It's something you get with over-the-counter units. Apart from the maps, I also got the compass, waterproof matches, whistle, emergency space blanket, and the fire tinder. Never had to open this bag once, never hoped to have to open this bag once, but it's one of those things where you pretty much always got to have it in, is just in case. First aid kit is just a day pack kit from REI. The only thing I added to it was ibuprofen pills, just in case I got headaches with the altitude, and I also brought some airborne chewable tablets. The 3mm accessory cord I used for hanging my food from the bears. I actually did not bring a carabiner on this trip. The Havilon Piranha knife, I didn't get a chance to use it on this trip, but I've used it on several deer, and I absolutely love the knife. I brought, I think, 6 extra blades, would have been plenty. The Allen game bags, I'm not a huge fan of them. Of course, I never used them yet, so it's tough to really say for sure. But I'm thinking that in the future, and I'd love to get some feedback on this if you guys have any recommendations, I'd like to get some higher quality game bags, something that's gonna protect the meat a little bit better, something that is a little bit lighter and more compressible so it doesn't take up so much of my day pack space. So if you guys got any recommendations for those, just leave them in the comments down below. I'd appreciate it. Electronics, this is where I had a lot of weight, and actually I brought more weight than what's listed on here. As kind of a last minute thing, I threw in a few extra batteries. I threw in my Nex camera that I wasn't planning on packing. So I'd say for electronics, I was well over 8 pounds on this trip. But the headlamp worked fine, just a little cheap $4 headlamp from Home Depot. It runs off of 3 AAA batteries, and I used the same pair for the entire trip. I think I brought 6 spares just in case, and I'd probably do that again just because you don't want to run out of headlamp batteries, and those batteries weigh almost nothing. One new addition was the Sony Hdr Cx 240. It's actually what I'm filming this with right now. I didn't camouflage it on the hunt, and that's probably one thing I would have done differently to it. I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it or not, but I got it for like 80 bucks on eBay. Just a heck of a deal. So now I'm probably gonna keep it and just camouflage it and then just use it for whatever. Probably not for deer hunting because the low light isn't that great with a very small sensor, but the zoom range is nice. It's got a nice steady shot, so I'll definitely keep it for out west. The Anker Efore battery pack is always nice to have. When you got the kind of electronics that I have, I used it to charge this camera a couple times on the trip. I used it to charge my Sony action cam once, and then I used it to charge my cell phone a couple times, you know, from all the Facebook updates that I made throughout the trip. The Sony Nex camera, the mirrorless camera that I do a lot of my time lapses with, that thing I brought like 3 or 4 extra batteries because some of those time lapses, particularly the night time lapses, really drain the battery. The Garmin 62S, same good things I have to say about it this trip that I had to say about it last year. And I also have a review for this particular model of GPS that you guys can look at. I used the GPS very sparingly on this trip to try and conserve battery. So basically, if I was on a ridge, I was on a trail, and I knew where I was at on the topo, I didn't use the GPS, leave it turned off. But if I was going off the trail and it was at night. Then I used the GPS, left it on, and I think on day 6 I finally needed to change the batteries. Here's one thing I'll say about the GPS versus the map and compass. We had a couple guys, older guys in our group this year. One of them didn't have a GPS, and a thing that he remarked on was that he was impressed by our ability to find our way in the dark. You know, so it's like we'd both go 3/4 of a mile from camp, but in that last half hour light, it starts getting dark. The guy without the GPS is like, okay, well, I know what direction I need to go, but I know there's a lot of deadfall. You know, it's easy to get turned around. So he would, you know, really feel comfortable starting to walk with 15, 20 minutes of prime time still left. Whereas with our GPSs, we could just sit there until, you know, at the very end of legal shooting light and then start walking back. In fact, one day, the day that I passed on the cow, we were over a mile from camp, and that cow showed up at like, gosh, maybe 3 or 4 minutes before the end of shooting light. So it's like if we didn't have the GPSs and, you know, day 4 or whatever, it's like, oh man, I should probably start getting back to camp so I can find my way. This is a spot I've only been to once. Then I probably would have gotten up early and I would have missed seeing those elk altogether. Deadfall was just a big thing out there. And it's not like there was deadfall everywhere. There'd be big chunks of deadfall. So it's like if we were going up 400 feet and east 3/4 of a mile to get to a spot, sometimes we'd have to go up 800 feet, then east a 1/4 mile, then south for 200 yards, and then east for another 1/4 mile. So, you know, it's like you can't just go one direction, which is what you'd like to do if you had a map and compass. And having a GPS and you do that route one time in the daylight to find the easiest route around all that deadfall, now you can do it at night. Whereas with a compass, it makes it really tough to know exactly what elevation you're at and exactly what route you need to take, and you end up going through a lot more sticky situations, a lot more deadfall. That deadfall can get pretty dangerous, especially if it's wet. You can't exactly see all the little sticks and stuff that are on the ground. You take a step over one deadfall, you could very easily roll your ankle. So we like to try to avoid that deadfall at all if possible, although most of the time it wasn't possible to avoid it completely. Walkie Talkies, again, I mean, the walkie talkies that we had on this trip, and I mentioned this last year too, they're like 36-mile range walkie talkies. And there were often times where we were a half mile apart, 3/4 of a mile apart, and we could not communicate. But the cell phones on the particular mountain that we were on worked just fine. So a lot of times we didn't even use the walkie talkies, we just used the cell phones, gave a text message update right after dark, you know, I'm on my way back, just to kind of give everybody a heads up. As far as the calls, I really liked the bugle that I had. I wasn't a huge fan of the reeds. I had a double and a triple reed. They weren't fantastic. I think part of the reason was I was using a double and triple when I should have been using a single and double. So what I'm going to do over the next year or so is I'll just order a few single and double reeds from a couple different manufacturers, a couple different styles, see which ones fit my mouth the best, play around with them, see which ones I like the best, and then I'll get a lot better idea of what I want to bring. Ideally, I'd like to have one reed that's kind of an all-around reed. I can make cow sounds and bull sounds, and then one that's just a specific locator bugle. Because I will say one thing, when I had that bull coming in and I was trying to bugle with a triple reed and I would try and switch out back to the double to make the cow sounds, it was really a pain knowing that he was so close and I was making all that movement. And I didn't bring any bow repair stuff. The only thing I did bring was an Allen wrench. I'm a huge fan for boots of these Cabela's Mindle Ultralights. I used them last year, loved them, used them this year, and I think if I remember right, I looked at Google Earth after we got back. Over the course of 6 days, I had put on 37 miles and climbed and descended around 7,000 feet. And throughout that time, I never had any hot spots, never had any blisters, never had any discomfort in my feet. There was a lot more volume that I was used to with my training, so sometimes I would have, you know, like the bottom of my foot would tighten up a little bit, or my knee would get a little bit sore, but then it'd be gone after sleeping it off. You know, just general overuse, overwork type of feelings, but never anything that was directly related to my boots. A couple other guys in our group also have Mindles of different models, and they love them as well. For my base layer top, I use the Merino wool quarter zip from Cabela's. I haven't tried First Light or any of the stuff that's supposed to be the best, but I will say that this Cabela's one seems to work just fine. In fact, I use it not just for elk hunting, but I use it for deer hunting, bear hunting, pretty much everything as a base layer. The Vertigo Softshell pants, I like them as far as comfort. One thing I will say is that as a soft shell. They're not quite as waterproof as I'd like them to be. As I mentioned earlier, we had some rain on this trip, and it performed just, pretty much fine in the rain. I never really got soaked through from the rain, but what that rain did was it made everything wet, and it was cloudy the next couple of days. It never really dried up, so we had basically 2 or 3 day span where the woods were just soaked. So I'm walking through knee-high tall grass over deadfalls, and all that time my pants never really had a chance to dry out. Eventually they soaked completely through, got onto my socks, started getting my socks wet inside of my boots. And so the one thing that I would definitely bring next year, this is the must-have addition to this list, is a pair of Gators. I met a couple other guys in the mountains that were wearing the Gators, and it seemed like they were doing just fine. I also met people that had the rain pants. One guy was using, I think, the Sitka downpour pants, and he seemed to like those. They looked a little bit noisier than the soft shells I was wearing. He said he had, I think, 1 pinprick hole from going over deadfall, but that was it. I think from a cost perspective, the Gators would probably do what I need them to do for the amount of rain that you're going to get on those early September hunts, or mid-September hunts, I should say. And then the top was also the soft shell. The only difference about this one is lined with fleece, so it's really quite a bit warmer than the pants. The pants aren't lined with that Sherpa fleece. I use this a lot for deer hunting. One thing I will say about the camo pattern, it worked really well in the aspens, in the open areas, but a lot of the stuff that we were hunting was thick spruce, evergreen, firs, pines, and I think it really stood out a lot in that type of environment. But 90% of the time I was just wearing that quarter zip merino wool. I only used this for the last 15-20 minutes of daylight, and sometimes the first 15-20 minutes of daylight. So I didn't really get a lot of use out of this, but there was definitely some times where I'm really glad that I had it. The binoculars 12x50 are a little bit big for bow hunting, in my opinion, unless you're going to use them as kind of like an in-between between binoculars and the spotting scope. Even with that nice backpack suspension system, they're still bouncing around quite a bit. By day 3, I didn't even bring them anymore. The reason I would just leave them at camp was because the area that we were in, you didn't really have opportunities to glass long range. The most you would ever see in one particular spot was maybe 150, 200 yards. And I always figured that if I did have an elk within range, I'd be able to tell if it was a legal bull or not, or if it was a cow. So from that perspective, the binoculars weren't really going to help me out a whole bunch. No problem with the bow at all. I did do one thing different this year with my bow that I hadn't done in the past, and that was try a single pin slider sight. The reason I switched to the single pin was that I wanted to be able to practice out further, practice out to 80, practice out to 100. And I actually do really like the way that that single pin slider looks. I like how open my field of view is. There was a couple times on this trip in particular where I ended up with the pin at the wrong spot at the wrong time. The first time was when that bull came through. He was on a beeline to a shooting lane 20 yards from me, had the pin set at 20 yards, drew back quick, and sure enough, he wins me. And by the time he stops and I swing my bow around, he's probably 60 yards and my pin's still at 20 and he's looking back my direction. I don't really have the luxury of being able to pull the bow back down, range them, then change the sight, clip my release back on, then look back up at the elk, draw back. It's just too much. It's nice when you have the opportunity to range, or at least know how far away the elk is going to be, and then draw back. But when you got those quick scenarios where the range of the animal changes so fast, it's really a downside for that single pin sight. That being said, I'll probably stick with it just because I think eventually I will get used to it, and I do really like the way that it looks through that peep sight. Alright, so real quick here, let's look at the right side of the spreadsheet. You can see the possible upgrades I would make in the future. 3 of them have to do with the shelter and sleeping. I really like the idea of this Kifaru Mega Tarp, but given the price, I won't buy one. I would much rather make my own, and since there's already people that have done it on the internet, it'll just be a matter of me following their instructions, getting the right material, and learning how to sew from YouTube. So that's my plan. I'll probably make an annex for it as well so that I can put a stove in at some point. The nice thing about a shelter like this, of course, is you can pitch it with trekking poles, and the weight of the fabric itself and all of the guy lines is just a little over a pound, and it has enough storage for 2 people plus gear plus a little bit of firewood. Being able to camp with a stove would especially come in handy if I ever decide to do more rifle hunts down the road, which are normally later in the season when snow is quite a good possibility. So the next thing would be a sleeping bag, and you can look at the weight savings here. The current bag that I have is a 15 degree long bag, 46 ounces. Compare this to the Enlightened Equipment Revelation 10 degree quilt, 22.6 ounces. Huge difference in weight here. You can see this one's less than half the weight and a little bit warmer, more versatile being a quilt. It comes at a pretty steep price tag, but comparatively speaking, that price point is not bad. If you get a quilt high end from other manufacturers, you're looking at paying a lot more. This would still be pretty hard to justify. So now let's look at sleeping pads. The Therm-A-Rest Neo-Air line is some of the best that you can get in terms of lightweight and quality. Comes with a steep price tag, but let's look at the Neo-Air X Lite, which is kind of their most ultralight model. You get a full-size sleeping pad, and it has a 2.5 inch thickness, R value 3.2, and of course, according to them, that means that you can sleep on ground when it's 20 degrees and still be comfortable. For colder, and remember I said before, if I wanted to do rifle hunts down the road where there's going to be a lot of snow, it might be later October, then they also have the Neo-Air Rx Therm. This one's 15 ounces, so it's barely any heavier, still 2.5 inches thick, and yet this one has an R value of 5.7. And then they rate that down to, looks like they got the comfort rating at right around -15 or so. You'll read some reviews on these pads that say they're not that durable. I don't think that's that big of a deal. I think sleeping pad durability is more in how you take care of your equipment and where you decide to pitch your tent. I think the biggest downside is the price. You're looking at around $200 for this one and $150 for the lighter weight version. So that one's going to be pretty hard to justify in terms of cost. And then the last thing, of course, would be the Gators, which I'm considering more of a need instead of a want, which is what these three things are. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. That's the gear review in its entirety. If you have any questions, please let me know. Leave a comment, send me a message over on Facebook, and I'll do my best to get back to you.